The Wehrmacht High Command. From mid-1940 onwards, the Wehrmacht High Command was part of the High Command of the Armed Forces. It was reorganized by Hitler on February 4, 1938, from the Wehrmacht office that worked in the Reich Ministry of War, and consisted of the three branches, Army, Air Force, and Navy, which gave it decisive influence over the planning, execution, and coordination of military operations during the war. An examination of this Wehrmacht command and administrative authority, which was indirectly subordinated by Hitler on February 7, 1938, impressively shows the structures, decision-making processes, and the complexity of military leadership in the context of a world war, and also illustrates the interaction between decisions made by political and military leadership levels and the far-reaching consequences that resulted for the course of the war. In addition to the Wehrmacht Operations Office, which was taken over on August 23, 1939, by General Alfred Jodl, who was born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, and grew up in the Royal Bavarian Artillery. The chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, General of the Artillery, Wilhelm Keitel, was also in charge of the Foreign Intelligence Division under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the General Wehrmacht Affairs Division under General Hermann Reinecke, and the Military Economy and Armaments Office under General Georg Thomas. With the establishment of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in 1938, Hitler made another move to gain absolute power over the German armed forces. He had thus personally assumed supreme command and at the same time completely abolished the position of Reich Minister of War. Until then, that position had been held by General von Blomberg, who resigned after suggestive photos of his new wife were found, and to make matters worse, Hitler and Goering had been his witnesses at the wedding. General Keitel was responsible for organizing the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. He first set up the Führungsstab, leadership staff, which then became the Wehrmacht Command, headed by Lieutenant General Max von Viebahn from February 21, 1938. At the heart of the Wehrmacht Command Office was Department L for National Defense, which had been in existence since the year 1934, and from that time onwards also served as the staff of the Reich Minister of War for the organization and command issues of the Wehrmacht. Since the 1st of July 1935, it had been headed by Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Jodl of the General Staff, who had been subordinate to the aforementioned Lieutenant General Max von Viebahn since the reorganization of the 8th of February 1938. But on March 17, 4 weeks after his appointment, Viebahn was first granted leave and then, in April, was completely relieved of his post as head of the Wehrmacht Operations Office, which meant that Lieutenant Colonel Jodl took over the office in a dual capacity. So, what was the reason for Viebahn's dismissal from service? He had been specially promoted to this position by the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Ludwig Beck, who was considered part of the early resistance and a victim of the failed coup of July 20, 1944, in order to have an additional break within the army leadership against Hitler's war course, which Beck considered too risky. But when, during the first half of March 1938, Austrian and German National Socialists demanded the incorporation of the Austro-Fascist Federal State of Austria into the National Socialist German Reich, annexing the Republic of Austria and incorporating it into the German Reich as the Ostmark, a process that Hitler had orchestrated behind the scenes. Viebahn suffered a nervous breakdown. The lieutenant general had feared that the Austria crisis could lead to a general European war, which would end in disaster for the German Reich, which was not prepared for it. His despair over what he considered playing with fire by the political and military leadership of the Reich had gone so far that he suffered fits of sobbing and locked himself in his office. The result was his dismissal by Hitler and Keitel, even his commitment to a mental hospital, and the appointment of Alfred Jodl, who had been promoted to Major General on the 1st of April 1939 as the new head of the Wehrmacht Leadership Office, who, in accordance with his mobilization order, took up this position at the start of the war on the 1st of September 1939. His previous position as head of Department L National Defense was taken over by Colonel Inspector General Walter Wehrmacht. During the war against Poland, Jodl stayed with Hitler in his special train in the German-Polish border area from September 3rd, while his staff, led by Colonel Wehrmacht, remained in Berlin. Alongside the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Keitel, Jodl was, from then on, Hitler's primary advisor on all matters of operational command of the Wehrmacht. His area of responsibility included the uniform handling of all questions relating to overall warfare and the processing of Hitler's strategic directives. Within his office, he was able to make decisions on all matters relating to warfare, but not on matters of a fundamental nature. In addition to Department L, Jodl was also in charge of the Wehrmacht Propaganda and Wehrmacht Communications departments. His staff was Department L, now headed by Colonel Wehrmacht, which was often referred to in the language of the time as the Jodl staff or Wehrmacht's staff. The staff was composed of the Army, Navy, and Air Force operations groups, as well as the organizational group and the quartermaster group. Colonel Wehrmacht, head of Department L, was also responsible for the leader of the war diary and an office officer with a registry. The main task of Department L was to process Hitler's directives to the three branches of the Wehrmacht and the highest Reich authorities. Another task of L was to keep Colonel General Keitel constantly informed about the military situation, and to compile documents for Major General Jodl's ongoing briefings to Hitler. In doing so, he relied on the reports transmitted and then summarized by Colonel Wehrmacht from the branches of the Wehrmacht. The daily Wehrmacht report, which the Wehrmacht Propaganda Department drafted, received its penultimate version from Jodl before Hitler then approved the final text. However, up to that point, Jodl's activities were not really decisive for the war, because especially at the beginning of the war, the position of the Wehrmacht Operations Office was still relatively weak. The reason for this was that the high commands of the three branches of the Wehrmacht, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, were jealous of their independence. For example, the chief of the Army General Staff, General Franz Halder, immediately before the start of the Polish campaign and shortly after Jodl's appointment as head of the Wehrmacht Command Office, intervened with General Keitel as a preventive measure and asked him to ensure that the Wehrmacht Command Office did not interfere in the conduct of operations, as the Army High Command alone was responsible for the campaign and would report directly to Hitler. However, this division of responsibilities was not chosen at random, but deliberately by Hitler in his desire not to let any one side become too powerful, in accordance with the saying, probably originating from Machiavelli, divide and rule. The Wehrmacht High Command had no authority over the three branches of the Wehrmacht, but was rather intended to be a balancing force for conflicting views and aspirations within the Wehrmacht. That is, to keep the normal, sometimes critical competition between the front and the leadership within reasonable bounds. However, while the operational plans for the war against Poland were still in the hands of the Army High Command, the High Command of the Armed Forces took command of the entire operation for the first time during the planning and execution of the so-called Worcester exercise for the occupation of Norway and Denmark from the 9th of April to the 10th of June, 1940. In this operation, Major General Jodl and the operations staff, which was composed of one general staff officer from each of the three branches of the Wehrmacht and the Wehrmacht Operations Office, were subordinate. The Wehrmacht operations staff was also involved in the preparations for the Western Campaign, starting on May 20, 1940, in the form of almost daily meetings between Hitler, Keitel, and Jodl, the results of which were then communicated to the high commands of the branches of the armed forces, sometimes orally and sometimes in written form. During the first phase of the Western Campaign, the field unit of the Wehrmacht High Command, which from then on was permanently assigned to the so-called Führer headquarters, was housed in a completely unfinished farmhouse in Münstereifel-Rodert, not far from Hitler's command post at Felsenest. Incidentally, this facility was the only Führer headquarters that did not receive a new code name, but instead took on the topographical name of the Felsenest Ridge. In the 70s, the name Felsenest was then removed from the official topographical map, and the hill was renamed Ezelsberg. In the next main headquarters, Wolf's Lair 1 in Brûlé-de-Péché near the Belgian border, the staff worked in wooden barracks, while Keitel and Jodl were housed in the local school, where the map and lecture room was also located. During the Western Campaign, Hitler's influence on command leadership became visible and tangible for the first time, as he used the Wehrmacht Operations Office as the organ for unified and authoritative command issuance. After the announcement of the armistice with France on July 25, 1940, its staff was accommodated in this inn, located in the immediate vicinity of the new Führer headquarters Tannenberg in the northern Black Forest, over which a guest ban had been imposed. After the victory over France, Jodl presented a memorandum on further conduct of the war on June 30, 1940, according to which both the Luftwaffe and the Navy could weaken England with their attacks. The Army would also not encounter any serious resistance during a landing. See my video, Siloe 1940, for more on this. But with his militarily, economically, and politically reckless misjudgment, Jodl had both overestimated the capabilities of the Navy and Air Force, and completely neglected the political factors of the increasingly rigid stance of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. In his biography of Jodl, historian Bodo Schurig identified the limitations that had become apparent during the Second World War. Still an officer of functional obedience, unwilling and unable to think politically, he willingly embodied the renunciation of the duties of a commander. Jodl's mentality became the hallmark of pure military technicians, and his influence on the overall command staff became irresponsible. After the end of the Western Campaign, the field squadron of the Wehrmacht Command Office was initially stationed in Berlin for the next few weeks and later in Salzburg, where it was parked with its Atlas train at the local railway stations. On July 2, 1940, the Wehrmacht Command Office issued a directive for preparations for an invasion of England, signed by Keitel to the three branches of the Wehrmacht. In the end, the further elaborations of the Command Office on landing operations against England resulted in Directive No. 16, which was then approved by Hitler as Operation Sea Lion on July 16, 1940. On August 8, 1940, the Wehrmacht Command Office was renamed the Wehrmacht Operations Staff. However, due to the increase in personnel, working conditions on the train had become so cramped that Keitel had the staff relocated in the fall of 1940 to the Cavalry and Armored Troops School in Krampnitz, which offered much more space. Since the planning and execution of the Balkan Campaign, which began on April 6, 1941, with the attack on Yugoslavia and Greece, were in the hands of the Army General Staff, The Wehrmacht operations staff limited itself to processing the directives issued by Hitler for the cooperation of the branches of the Wehrmacht and their collaboration with the Allied Italian, Bulgarian, and Hungarian units. This campaign, shown here on the map of operations in Greece, had become necessary after the attack on Greece by Italy, Germany's ally, which began on October 28, 1940, ended in disaster. I am quoting Wikipedia now. The Balkan campaign delayed the start of the war against the Soviet Union by 6 weeks and made it more difficult for the Wehrmacht to carry out its plan to capture the capital, Moscow, in a blitzkrieg before the onset of winter. During the Balkan campaign, both Hitler and the field staff stayed in their special trains in the small lower Austrian town of Möhnenkirchen, where both trains were parked on a disused railway line right next to a tunnel. When, in the spring of 1941, a possible conflict with the Soviet Union became apparent, and Berlin now had to decide whether to favor a political or military solution, both Keitel and Jodl, by virtue of their positions, would have had the opportunity to oppose Hitler forcefully. But when he decided on the path of violence, both remained silent, just as they had at the end of August 40, when Hitler had presented his plan to the generals to defeat the Soviet Union in a swift campaign and thus force England to make peace. He had expressed the opinion that the Wehrmacht was strong enough for a two-front war against Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Except for Admiral Canaris, who relied heavily on conversations with the German military attaché in Moscow, General Ernst Köstring, none of the top military leaders seriously contradicted Hitler at the time, not even Jodl. In preparing for the Eastern Campaign, the activities of the Wehrmacht operations staff were limited to working on Hitler's directive and compiling the timetable. While immediately after the start of Operation Barbarossa, the field staff had moved into their prepared quarters on the Rastenburg-Angerburg railway line, about 1 kilometer from Hitler's main headquarters, Wolfslehr, Keitel, and Jodl were accommodated in the so-called Security Zone 1 with Hitler. The daily routine was organized so that Jodl would present the situation report, which his staff had compiled during the night, to Hitler at the so-called midday briefing, while in the afternoon, Major General Walter Warlimont would present the interim reports. Between 10 and 11 o'clock in the evening, the so-called evening briefing took place in a small circle. Since practically every situation report presented to Hitler was also the issuing of orders, Jodl or Warlimont would write down his decisions and instructions, add their own notes, and then forward them to the staff for further processing. Jodl testified during the Nuremberg trials that, from the beginning of the war until April 1, 945, he probably took part in about 5,000 meetings at the Führer headquarters, where he could be considered one of Hitler's closest military advisors. This was especially true for the period after the dismissal of the commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, who was held responsible for the setbacks in the Battle of Moscow on December 19, 1941, and the subsequent complete assumption of command by Hitler. Keitel, who had been promoted to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, and was often called Lack Keitel behind his back, because of his behavior towards Hitler, as well as the chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff. Jodl did not comment on Hitler's decision to dismiss Brauchitsch as usual and continued as before. And this, even though Hitler only involved them in his solitary decisions about the conduct of the war in the East when it came to fundamental resolutions. Now the separation between Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and Oberkommando des Heerestheaters of War began. While the Army General Staff was responsible for the entire Eastern Front, from now on, the Wehrmacht High Command had to deal with the following theaters of war: Denmark, Norway, Northern Finland, Africa, Italy, the Balkans, and the West. This meant that Jodl's staff had become the Second Army Operations Staff for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht theaters of war, which, due to the increased responsibilities, required further reinforcement. As of January 1, 1942, General Wehrmacht, seen here on the left with Field Marshal Keitel, became the Deputy Chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff. The previous operational groups were expanded into operational departments, now with a total of 40 officers and civil servants. But even the always obedient Jodl, who had since been promoted to General of the Artillery, was too much of a seasoned soldier to still believe in a complete victory by the turn of 1941 to 1942 at the latest. He then pressed Hitler to shorten the Eastern Front, and also indirectly accused him of not only overestimating German forces, but also of taking too much influence over the overall conduct of the war. The major rift between Hitler and Jodl occurred when he defended the commanders of the Caucasus Army, who had carried out Operation Edelweiss in August and September 1942 to secure, among other things, the oil fields in and around Baku against Hitler, who was once again railing against his generals, and proved that they had only been following Hitler's orders. As a result, Hitler had planned to replace Jodl with Colonel General Friedrich Paulus as soon as he had captured Stalingrad with his 6th Army, which, as we know, did not happen. But this rift had now also brought direct changes for Jodl. Because whereas up to now he had presented the overall situation with a brief overview of the Eastern Front, starting in October 1942, the situation conferences now began with the report of the Chief of the Army General Staff, Colonel General Kurt Zeitzler. Jodl's reports were limited to those of the so-called Oberkommando der Wehrmacht theaters of war. In order to have his staff close to him during his increasingly frequent stays at Hitler's Berghof in Berchtesgaden, Jodl moved the field detachment for the first time in November 1942 to the Mountain Infantry Barracks in Strub, a district of Bischofswiesen. Then, while in December 942, the 6th Army was encircled in Stalingrad and the German-Italian Africa troops were partly retreating in a panic towards Tunisia or being taken prisoner, Jodl's staff presented its last strategic assessment for the year 1943 in which, among other things, hard to believe, even an offensive towards Persia was considered. And on the occasion of a visit to Berlin by Japanese officers, Jodl explained the German plans to them on April 18, 1943. The submarine war will continue to have an effect. The European mainland is secure. In the east, we must continue to weaken the enemy in terms of manpower. The air raids are unpleasant, but 80% of the damage is to buildings, whereas damage to industry can be compensated for. The enemy may be able to replace aircraft if the German air defense is successful, but in the long run, they will not be able to replace their crews. But at the latest, with the surrender of the Africa troops on May 13, 1943, Jodl's assessment of the situation was nothing more than waste paper, because with the fall of North Africa, the strategic southern flank of the Axis powers Germany and Italy had grown even larger. As a consequence, units had to be transferred to Italy and Greece, forces that were urgently needed on other theaters of war. And after 43 German submarines had been sunk in May alone, Grand Admiral Dönitz temporarily suspended the submarine war against convoys and recalled most of the submarines from the so-called pack operations. This meant that the last German weapon of attack had been lost, as it had become increasingly difficult for the Luftwaffe, which had been weakened since the Battle of Britain in 1940, to effectively combat the Allied bomber streams. By now, many senior officers in the army had come to believe that the top leadership had no plan. For example, the head of the organization department in the Oberkommando, der Heeres Major General Helmut Stief, wrote to his wife on June 18, 1943, describing the conditions at the Führer headquarters. There is a terrible atmosphere of recklessness, lethargy, complacency, ostrich politics, arrogance, and lack of vision. And even Hitler is said to have admitted to Grand Admiral Dönitz in the summer, quote, "I'm muddling through from one month to the next." But muddling through now also applied to the Wehrmacht operations staff. Nevertheless, just like Hitler, Jodl believed that the war should be fought as far away from the German borders as possible. However, this came with significant disadvantages, since fighting on overstretched fronts prevented the army from forming reserves and forced the Air Force to deploy strong forces to support ground troops in the Soviet Union and Italy. In general, even in the third year of the war, a certain degree of egoism was still evident among the officers serving in the leadership of the three branches of the Wehrmacht, especially when it came to withdrawing from sections of the front. For example, the army had been burdened by front sections far forward, but from the perspective of the Air Force and the Ministry of Armaments, these were important because only from airfields deep in Russian territory could enemy production facilities be attacked. In contrast, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, had no interest at all in the army remaining in the north near Leningrad or on the Crimea in the Black Sea, whereas the Crimea was considered important by the Foreign Ministry, since in their view, only the presence of German troops on this peninsula could guarantee Turkey's neutrality. Now, in this situation, one might have expected the absolute ruler and supreme commander of the Wehrmacht to make fundamental decisions in one direction or another during his situation briefings. But instead, he preferred to concern himself with the position of individual battalions on the main front line in the east, or gave lengthy lectures at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht about military leadership. In July 1943, the Wehrmacht had to endure further heavy defeats. Operation Citadel, the German summer offensive on the Eastern Front, had failed. At the end of July 1943, Hamburg had been attacked for several days by British and American bombers, and, in what they called Operation Gomorrah, was largely destroyed, with at least 34,000 people burned or killed. From July 10th to August 17th, 1943, the Western Allies landed in Sicily during Operation Husky. See this video. Benito Mussolini was overthrown on July 25th. German troops had marched into Italy and disarmed their old ally. On September 3rd, Italy and the Allies had negotiated an armistice, which led to Italy declaring war on Germany on October 13th. All in all, 1943 was the year in which, upon thorough and realistic assessment of their own strength and the enemy's potential, the political and military leaders could only draw one conclusion: that the war could no longer be won. But since this realization was out of the question for Hitler, the war for his regime was also a struggle for survival, fought on the backs of the Germans who longed for peace. Jodl later tried to justify himself this way. In the Führer headquarters, politics and the military were strictly separated, and Hitler also showed no inclination to discuss political matters with his highest-ranking generals. Jodl, who, quote, wanted to avoid the slippery floor of politics, also did not see himself as a strategist, but rather, again quoting, as an assistant to a strategist. By strategy, he meant the highest level of leadership activity in war. It encompasses foreign and domestic policy, military operations and war economy, propaganda and leadership of the people, and must bring all these war-critical elements into alignment for the purposes and political goal of the war. Once you begin to understand the concept of strategy in this way, no one can doubt anymore that it is not a general, but only a statesman who can be a strategist. For the Colonel General, it was not the soldier's task to define the goal of strategic action. This also confirms the characterization of Jodl by his biographer Schurz. If one distinguishes between grand and logistical strategy, he was merely a logistician, a general of tactical, technical, and organizational troop leadership. He lacked the broad overview, unable to sense the conflicts of the real battlefield, and would always have had to leave grand strategy to others. In the highest position, he was objectively the wrong choice. However, no one would have exceeded his competencies. On January 30th, 1944, Jodl was promoted to Colonel General after his wife Irma, née Countess von Bouillon, died of pneumonia following an operation in Königsberg, East Prussia, on April 18th. He married Louise Katharina von Bender on April 7, 1945, a friend of his first wife and former secretary at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. On the Eastern Front, from June 22nd to August 20th, the Red Army destroyed Army Group Center with their Operation Bagration, a much greater catastrophe than Stalingrad. And meanwhile, the English and Americans had complete air superiority at the fronts and over Germany, making the overall military situation increasingly hopeless. When the bomb left by Count Stauffenberg detonated on July 20th, 1944, at the Führer headquarters Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia, both Jodl and the deputy chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, General of Artillery Warlimont, were wounded. On September 6th, he was replaced by the former Chief of Staff of Army Group F, Lieutenant General August Winter, who took up his post on December 1st, 1944, and remained in this position until the end of the war. Winter was promoted to General of the Mountain Troops on May 1, 1945, making him one of the few Army generals who had never directly commanded a unit. Despite the obvious decline, Jodl continued to spread confidence among his officers, pointing to the still increasing German armaments production and the imminent deployment of technologically superior weapons, such as jet fighters, new submarines, or rockets. Criticism of Hitler's conduct of the war was still not voiced, since in his view, it was not the duty of a soldier to give recommendations to the politicians at the head of a state. With this, Jodl once again underscored how unfit he was for this highest military position, although this was exactly what Hitler had calculated. For the Ardennes offensive, ordered by Hitler and carried out from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, drafts and calculations of forces were carried out by a small circle of staff members from the Wehrmacht operations staff. During the actual offensive, the staff was housed in the war-term barracks in Friedberg, Hesse, while Hitler, along with Jodl and the Feldstaffel, had moved into the bunker complex near Ziegenberg in the Taunus, the Führer headquarters Adlerhorst. When failure became apparent after just a few days, Jodl is said to have tried at the end of December 1944, quote, to persuade Hitler by indirect means and by presenting false facts in an ultimately fruitless one-on-one conversation to bring about a political end to the war. When the headquarters was moved to Berlin in January 1945, on January 16th, Field Marshal Keitel, as well as Colonel General Jodl, had moved into their official residences in Berlin-Dahlem, and the field staff into the Maybach I camp near Zossen. On April 20th, 1945, the staff was moved to the Reich Air Raid Protection School in Berlin-Wannsee, where the already planned division took place. While the majority of the staff moved between April 22nd and 24th in a motorized march to the Berchtesgaden area and was consolidated under the Deputy Chief of the Operations Staff, General Winter, into Operations Staff B South. The northern group under Field Marshal Keitel and Colonel General Jodl first moved to the Cavalry and Armored Troops School in Krampnitz, and from there, on April 29th, continued to the village of Dorben, where they stayed in the castle quarters. The map shows the gradual retreat northward via Dorben and ultimately to Flensburg-Meerwijk. The communication between the two staffs was maintained by radio. The Northern Command Staff had telephone contact with the Reich Chancellery or the Führerbunker in Berlin until the 28th of April. After, on April 25th, the Army General Staff was subordinated to the Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff by Hitler's order. Command of the so-called Eastern Theater of War was also transferred to the OKW. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Jodl contributed in the first days of May 1945 to finally ending the senseless German resistance. By Grand Admiral Dönitz, who had been appointed Reich President and Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht by Hitler before his suicide, Colonel General Jodl was awarded the Knight's Cross on May 6th, and supposedly also the Oak Leaves on May 7th. On that day, as Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, he signed the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht on all fronts on behalf of the German government at the headquarters of the Western Allied Forces in Reims, France. After that, Keitel ordered that the Wehrmacht Operations Staff and the subordinate parts of the Army General Staff be reorganized. The reason for this, as also communicated by Jodl, was that only a unified, clearly structured, and strictly controlled Wehrmacht command could ensure the orderly demobilization of the Wehrmacht. The merger of the two command staffs, North and South, which he had requested several times, had been rejected by the Allied Control Commission at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. While the Southern Command Staff and Field Marshal Kesselring were detained by the Americans at Königssee on May 3, 1945, the Northern Staff in Flensburg, along with around 300 cabinet members of the Dönitz government, was also arrested on May 23rd in a staged action for the press and taken into captivity. In the Nuremberg war crimes trial, Jodl was charged on all 4 counts. After nearly a year of trial, on October 1st, 1946, he was sentenced to death by hanging for conspiracy against world peace, planning and waging a war of aggression, crimes against the laws of war, and crimes against humanity, in a verdict that was not without controversy even among the judges. His request to be shot as a soldier was denied, as were the similar requests of Keitel and Göring. On October 16, 1946, late at night, the former chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, was hanged in Nuremberg, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Wensbach. Jodl had argued in the Nuremberg trial that, in principle, he had always just been the executive organ. But that only applied to the smaller part of his actions. The main part, as was also the case with General Field Marshal Keitel, was his almost completely uncritical support of Hitler's war plans. His compliant, patient behavior also made it possible that, alongside some foolish and pointless orders, a whole series of criminal orders against humanity were executed, which still burden Germany's account heavily, even after 80 years.